Since January 1st, the Pistons are 19-9. They've got the 6th highest net rating in the NBA with the number 12 offense and the number 2 defense in the entire league. And they are only 1 game back from the 4th seed in the Eastern Conference. Coming into this season, I think a lot of people expected the Pistons, after years and years of rebuilding and trying to compete around Cade Cunningham, to take that next step in their rebuild where they maybe make a play-in push and make the playoffs that way. But now we're at the point where not only are they probably going to make the playoffs outright, but they have a legitimate shot at getting home court advantage. And what's wild is you look at this stretch where they've had all of this success and you look at some of the teams that they're beating, and they've beat some pretty heavy hitters. They've got wins against the Celtics, against the Rockets, the Knicks, the Timberwolves, the Mavericks, the Clippers, the Magic. And I think this spawns some legitimate questions that we have to start asking about this Pistons team. Yeah, we got to think, okay, are they good enough to get that home court advantage? Can they end up as the 4 seed? I think the question starts to shift from that to, is this Pistons team good enough to win a playoff series? Because there's some other teams in the Eastern Conference right now that the Pistons could potentially match up with in the playoffs that look a little bit vulnerable. And the Pistons are starting to get hot at exactly the right time. Now, obviously, at the center of all of this success is Cade Cunningham. He's 6th in scoring since the start of the new year. He's 4th in assists per game. And it's crazy to me to look back on all the questions around Cade Cunningham that we had this offseason, where people were asking, can he be your franchise guy? Can he be your number 1? Can you build your entire team around him? Is he good enough to be that guy? And at least in my opinion, he's put all of those concerns to bed because of all of the improvements that he's made this year in every area of his game. You watch him in that game against the Celtics where the Celtics were throwing multiple defensive coverages at him, and it just really didn't matter because he was either going to make the right pass or he was going to get to his spot and score, and there really just wasn't a whole lot that you could actually do about it. When they threw drop coverage at him, he was making use of that mid-range game that he's built this year. When they were hedging him and throwing double teams at him, he was making the right read. And overall, he was just proving how much damage he can do when he's tasked with being your primary offensive engine. Overall, his playmaking has been elite. Like I said, he's 4th in assists per game, which assists per game isn't always the best playmaking stat, but for Cade, it makes sense how he's racking up all of these assists when you watch him play. He processes defenses so well, and in the past, he had the problem where defenses were happy to sell out on him because he wasn't really surrounded with good floor spacers. He didn't have shooters that he could rely on. So defenses would sell out on him because they knew, okay, he's going to kick it to a shooter in the corner, but that shooter's Killian Hayes. He's not going to make the 3. Now that shooter in the corner is Tobias Harris, or it's Tim Hardaway Jr., or it's Malik Beasley. And it's just such a drastic difference this year because the Pistons right now are 12th in 3-point field goal percentage. They are an above average 3-point shooting team. And this has had so many benefits for Cade Cunningham and really opening things up for him and allowing him to slow the game down and pick defenses apart. Now, one thing specifically that it's really opened up is the 2-man game with Jalen Duren. And I think Jalen Duren deserves a lot of credit for all of the improvements he's made as an offensive piece this year. I think his defense is something that's still got a little bit of a ways to go before it's really reaching the potential that I think he has. Obviously, coming into the NBA, he was touted for all of his ridiculous athletic ability, the physical traits that he has, and the potential to be an absolutely elite rim protector. And even though I don't think all of that has come to fruition yet, I do think that his offensive firepower and his connective passing ability and the support role that he's played alongside Cade in this pick and roll duo has carried a lot of weight for Detroit this year. He's actually Cade Cunningham's favorite assist target on the team. Duren has been assisted by Cade 103 times this year, the most on the team. Duren is shooting 72.7% on shots off of passes from Cade. You look at the fact that these two guys are surrounded by shooters now, and so the gravity that Cade and Duren have together opens things up for those shooters, and if defenses aren't willing to help off those shooters to sell out on stopping the Cade and Duren pick and roll, well then Cade and Duren are just going to find a way to score. Whether that's Cade getting to a spot or connecting with Duren, they're going to get points on the board. Now say that you double Cade, then he's probably going to find find Duren in space, and Duren's either going to go to the basket or process the defense if the defense sends a tag in order to find an open shooter. Now, if you don't double Cade, but you tag Duren's roll, well, then Cade's going to find the shooter on whichever corner. And I think this has given Detroit a really reliable infrastructure to work with to build the rest of their offense around. But then it really all starts to make sense when you look at some of the support guys that I mentioned earlier: Malik Beasley, Tim Hardaway Jr., Tobias Harris. Now, I specifically want to shout out Malik Beasley because he has been literally the best catch and shoot three-point shooter in the entire NBA this year. He's attempting 6.8 catch and shoot threes per game. He's hitting them at a 43.9% clip. And that's number one in the NBA on anyone who's attempting a meaningful volume of catch and shoot threes. They actually design plays specifically to get him open looks because of how reliable of a catch and shoot shooter he is. They do a lot of stuff setting him up to come off of flare screens and get open threes. They'll put him in off-ball actions where he's running into the paint and then popping out on the perimeter against a completely clueless defense in order to get an easy three. I cannot emphasize enough how elite Malik Beasley has been for this team. Then you have Tim Hardaway Jr. He's attempting 4.7 catch and shoot threes a game, and he's hitting them at a 38.2% clip. Tobias Harris, he's not necessarily elite as a catch and shoot guy, but he's at bare minimum passable. He's attempting 3.3 catch and shoot threes a game, hitting them at a 35.5% clip. Tim Hardaway Jr. and Tobias Harris are two guys that I've always said, if your goal is to win a championship, you're probably not super thrilled if they're both playing significant minutes and are significant parts of your rotation. But if your goal is to make the playoffs, if your goal is to be a good basketball team that wins more games than they lose, Tim Hardaway Jr. and Tobias Harris are good basketball players. Now, we can talk about the price tag and whether they've historically been worth the money that they've gotten or if they are currently worth the money that they're getting. This is what it really all comes down to for me. For so long, the Pistons have been putting guys next to Cade Cunningham that are players that you're not even sure if they're going to be in the league in a couple of years. It's really hard to win basketball games when you have guys who are fringe NBA players playing 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, 36 minutes a night. You're probably going to be a bad team because those guys aren't NBA players. But it turns out when you surround your star player with good basketball players, you'll probably end up winning more games. Now, real quick, guys, I want to take a second to thank the sponsor of today's video, SeatGeek. SeatGeek is the #1 rated ticketing app. I actually used SeatGeek recently to help me find tickets for the Timberwolves Thunder game. I've been able to go to multiple NBA games and NFL games because of SeatGeek. SeatGeek puts all of the tickets from across the internet into one place so that you can be sure you're getting a good deal. Each ticket is rated on a scale of 1 to 10, so look for the green dots to make sure you're getting the best deal possible, and you can avoid the red ones. And you know I came through for you guys. Use my code AlexHoops for $20 off your tickets at SeatGeek. That's $20 off your first purchase with promo code AlexHoops. Make sure you click the link in the description to download the app. Huge thanks again to SeatGeek for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to it. The other thing I love about what the Pistons are doing right now is they've got the veteran players, the players that are at bare minimum good basketball players, but they've also got the youth movement alongside all of this with guys like Ausar Thompson, Marcus Sasser, Jalen Duren, Isaiah Stewart, Ron Holland. All of these guys are contributing at a high level, and for a lot of them, the upside hasn't even been fully tapped yet, especially when you look at a guy like Ausar Thompson, who provides all defensive level impact on a nightly basis, and the offensive stuff that he's doing in terms of his connective passing, his transition playmaking. All of this stuff is moving mountains for Detroit. You look at his defense against the Celtics at the end of that first quarter in that game, where he pretty much completely turned off Boston's water all by himself. Now, the conversation about the Pistons gets really interesting when you start to ask the question of, can they win a playoff series? And if so, who do they have the best shot of winning a playoff series against? When we're talking about if the Pistons can win a playoff series, it's important to look at their half-court offense because when the pace of the playoffs slows down and teams aren't able to get out and run as much in transition, you're relegated to having to score predominantly in the half-court. Right now, Detroit is 16th in half-court offensive rating since January 1st, and they're 3rd in transition. Their current half-court offensive rating isn't necessarily bad, but is it good enough to win them 4 of 7 games in the first round of the playoffs? I think a big thing with Detroit is that defenses are probably going to look to take away the paint from them and force them to rely on shooters. And one of the problems that I think Detroit will end up running into is that it's going to be hard for them to have a lineup on the floor at all times where everyone is a reliable floor spacer. So when they have guys like Asar Thompson on the floor, when they have somewhat streaky shooters like Tobias Harris on the floor, those guys are probably going to be the weak links that a defense looks to help off of in order to sell out on Cade, Jalen Duren, Malik Beasley, Tim Hardaway Jr., guys that are more reliable scorers / shooters. And so I'll be interested to see how Detroit looks to overcome that. However, I will say that it's not like they're not going to be able to score in transition at all. And also, I think when you have a good defense and you have guys that can shoot, you're always going to have a chance in a playoff series. Another thing that I'm really interested to see is what is Cade Cunningham going to look like in the postseason? Because at least to me, he strikes me as the kind of guy who's going to rise in the playoffs as opposed to drop. Obviously, we don't have anything to quantify that right now because we haven't seen him in the playoffs yet, but just based on how he carries himself, how he operates in high pressure moments, I get the impression that his production should at least stay stable, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if it probably went up. You look at the teams that Detroit could potentially see in the playoffs in this kind of 4 through 6 range of the seeding. You've got the Pacers, you've got the Bucks, you've got the Knicks. You look at the season series between the Pacers and the Pistons this year, and the Pistons haven't had the most success. Same goes for the Bucks, but also I think a lot of those games occurred before Detroit really seemed to gel. And this kind of feels like a different team over the last couple of months. I look at a potential matchup with the Knicks, and even though I think the Knicks are a good team, I don't think that the Pistons' half-court offensive concerns would be as big of an issue for them against a Knicks team that has struggled defensively. And on the flip side, a high-powered offense like the Knicks is still going to be impacted by the elite defense that Detroit has become. So that's a potential matchup where I look at it and I say, I'm probably not going to bet the house on it, but I do think the Pistons have somewhat of a puncher's chance in that series. The other issue is experience. The Pistons don't have a ton of playoff experience on that roster. Yeah, they've got Malik Beasley, they've got Tim Hardaway Jr., they've got Tobias Harris. Those are a few guys who, yes, they have the playoff experience. But on the top end, like I said, we haven't seen Cade Cunningham in the playoffs yet. A lot of these young guys, they've never been to the playoffs before. We have no idea how they're going to handle that kind of environment. But regardless of all of this, I think we can get hung up on talking about, oh, are the Pistons good enough to win a playoff series? And I think that's kind of missing the forest for the trees. We're talking about the Detroit Pistons, a team that has been the worst or one of the worst teams in the league for the past 3 years now. And we're talking about them potentially getting home court advantage. They could get swept in the first round of the playoffs this year, and I think this season would be an overwhelming, resounding success, regardless of what happens in the postseason. I think if you're the Pistons, you take whatever happens as a win, assuming you make the playoffs, obviously. The season's not over yet, but now they can go forward and say, okay, we are a team that is good enough to make the playoffs. What else do we need to do from here? What are the weaknesses that we need to address? We still probably need to figure out the second star next to Cade. It might be Jaden Ivey, but he's hurt, so we're going to have to see what he looks like next season, or if he's back for the playoffs, we're going to see what that looks like. But they're now actually going to have solid data that they can use going forward to build a contender around Cade Cunningham. Really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to subscribe and leave a like. It really helps support the channel. Regardless, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.